Hello everyone, in today's video I am going to be reviewing the multiple spin-offs of the Anne of Green Gables series. Many books have been written pertaining to the characters of Anne of Green Gables and Avonlea. So some of these books were written by L.M. Montgomery herself, while others are written by various authors who, by all accounts, are Anne fanatics. If you're interested, you can go ahead and check out my last video where I reviewed all 9 books in the Anne of Green Gables series. So for these spin-offs, I have read 6 books. First, I read the Chronicles of Avonlea by L.M. Montgomery, and then I read the Further Chronicles of Avonlea by L.M. Montgomery, and then I read Before Green Gables by Budge Wilson. I then read Marilla of Green Gables by Sarah McCoy. I read Anne of Green Gables A New Beginning by Kevin Sullivan, and I read Maud by Melanie J. Fishbane. So without further ado, let's get into the video. Book I read is The Chronicles of Avonlea by L.M. Montgomery. This is a collection of short stories pertaining to the characters of Avonlea. Now, in many of these stories, Anne is either mentioned or she is present in the story itself, but usually very briefly. She's never a center character in the story. If you are a fan of Lucy Montgomery's writing, then you are more than likely going to like this, especially if you love Anne of Green Gables and Avonlea. These stories feature many different stories of the characters of Avonlea. There's romance, there's jilted lovers, there's babies being born, there's people dying. She's great. Just that classic old, Montgomery style. It's wonderful. So this is just a wonderful collection of short stories, and if you adore L.M. Montgomery's writing, then you are more than likely really going to love these stories. Anne is not mentioned in every single story, but she is mentioned in quite a majority of them. If you are reading this expecting that Anne is going to be a central character in every single story, then you might be a bit disappointed, as she is just kind of like a side character or someone who's briefly mentioned. Nevertheless, I did enjoy the majority of stories in this book. They're very entertaining, they're funny, some of them are sad. It's good writing. I love L.M. Montgomery's writing, so yeah, this is just wonderful. I rated it like a 4-star on Goodreads. It's great all around. So the Further Chronicles of Avonlea is just a tad bit different. This is a collection of about 15 short stories. Much like the first one, it does feature characters surrounding Avonlea, but in this we actually have more mention of Anne as well as other characters in the Anne of Green Gables series, specifically Diana, Rachel Lynde, Marilla, and Matthew Cuthbert. So these characters are either mentioned throughout the story or they're a part of the story. Even in one story, Anne is the narrator, and she and Diana are central characters to the story, so I thought that was great. But other than that, most of the other characters are kind of mentioned or have a small line in the story. So much like the other volume of Chronicles of Avonlea, this features marriages, deaths, jilted lovers, babies being born, people being killed. It's just good entertainment. So yeah, this is an enjoyable collection of short stories. I love, again, reading L.M. Montgomery's writing, so this was just great for me. Again, I rated a 4-star on Goodreads. Maybe a little bit more because I loved the addition of Anne's short story as well. So the next book we have is Before Green Gables by Budge Wilson. Before Green Gables is the story of young Anne Shirley before she came to Green Gables. This sequel is apparently approved by the hires of L.M. Montgomery, which frankly I find surprising because this was a terrible book. This is also approved as the official prequel to the Green Gables series, which it boggles my mind that this is even officially a part of the series. Basically, the story deals with the death of her parents and the many homes that Anne has to live in. Anne goes to 2 different homes in this book. First, the house of the maid that looked after her mother while she was pregnant with Anne. She is poor and very miserable. She has an alcoholic husband who is like a deadbeat, and he really cannot hold a steady job, so she's out working, trying to provide for her family. She has numerous bratty little children. Her husband also roughs her up every once in a while. So eventually Anne is living with his family, and they eventually move away from Anne's birthplace, Bolingbroke, to a different part of Nova Scotia, which is where Anne meets some of the more nicer characters. She meets characters such as the Eggman, who is a man that sells eggs. He was formerly a teacher. He teaches Anne how to read, and also convinces her foster mother to let her go to school, and eventually goes to school, where she then meets her teacher, whom she really loves. Those are the only two people in her life that Anne really loved and look up to, and people who really cherish her. So Anne's first foster family really treat her like she's a child slave. She does a lot of the heavy work. She cooks, she cleans, she looks after the kids and the babies, and she does the laundry, which is a lot of work for a little 9-year-old. Eventually she ends up at a different house because the husband ends up dying and they have to go move. The next foster home she goes to live at is just as remote and just as terrible and treats her just as bad, if not worse. She once again has to cook and clean and look after children, but her new foster mother, if you can even call her that, because she really isn't much of a mother, she just treats Anne like a little slave. She's crapping out kids like no tomorrow. I mean, oh my god. This woman has a kid almost every year, and it is so sad for Anne because she has to look after so many kids when she is a kid herself. The only break that Anne gets from this is when she is able to go to school. Because she lives where she lives, it's actually required for her to go to school, otherwise it's illegal and it looks bad on the parents. Anne eventually makes a few friends here and there. She makes friends with an older woman who lives down the road, and she really takes a liking to Anne, and Anne really likes her. She even loves Anne to a point, but then of course tragedy strikes again and she has to go eventually to an orphanage to live, which she is then adopted out to Green Gables. That's like pretty much the briefest summary of this book I can give you. The main issue that I have with this book is the writing. The writing, oh my god. It's a mess. It's so slow, it's clunky, it's sloppy. It's, you know, for a book that is approved as being the official prequel to Anne of Green Gables, I kind of expected the writing to be much better, and it was not. I know that the writer did not intend to write like L.M. Montgomery, but if she even tried a little bit to write like L.M. Montgomery, a lot of people might actually like this book a little bit better. But because the style is so different from L.M. Montgomery's own writing, most people hate the book, me included. When I read about Anne of Green Gables, I want to be drawn in by the writing like I am when I read L.M. Montgomery's writing. Terrible. And it's huge. This is like almost a 500-page book. A lot of the story could have been cut out and edited down. It was just way too long, too boring. Another thing that I didn't like is that the author completely could not capture the essence of Anne at all. Like, I felt like we weren't reading about Anne but a different character altogether, because really this didn't feel like Anne. It was actually quite hard for me to review this book because of there's so many hardships that Anne faces in the novel. I mean, she's pretty much treated like a child slave. It's actually terrible. This could have been a good book if the writing was improved on further, if the author actually kind of tried to even emulate a bit of L.M. Montgomery's writing style. I think the book could have improved vastly if she tried, but because she didn't, it ended up being a terrible book. Essentially, this book was not worth the time and the effort. If you were thinking about reading this, I would suggest you to skip it altogether. There are better books on this list for you to read. In the end, I ended up rating this book a 1.5 star. The next book we have is Marilla of Green Gables by Sarah McCoy. This is the story of Marilla. When Marilla is 13, her entire world is turned upside down when Marilla's mother dies, and she is kind of left to run the household for her father Hugh and her brother Matthew. Marilla has a burning desire to see the world and really, you know, get her education and learn. This is set in a day and age where women weren't encouraged to get educations, so Marilla really kind of struggles with that. But she does find inspiration of having her own life and getting the things that she feels that she needs or wants in the inspiration of her Aunt Izzy. In this book, Marilla joins the Lady A Society where she meets her soon-to-be best friend Rachel Lynde, and she also learns how to sew. She also meets the handsome John Blythe, and they fall scandalously in love. But ultimately, Marilla and John quarrel and they do not marry. Matthew, the quiet and shy Matthew, likes the girl, but they end up fighting and they don't marry, which is so sad for Matthew. In this book, Marilla also helps her Aunt Izzy with the Underground Railroad, because this story is set during a time of the Civil War down in the States with slavery going on, so Marilla does what she can to help the cause and hide slaves. I'm gonna say it right now, I love this book. If there is one Anne of Green Gables spinoff for you to read, it is this book here. This book was wonderful. The writing was beautiful. It felt like I was reading an L.M. Montgomery novel. So many of the questions we have about Marilla and Matthew are answered in this book, and answered beautifully and wonderfully, and it's so satisfying. We get to see what Matthew's and Marilla's mother and father were like. We get to see how Green Gables got its name. We get to see how Rachel and Marilla became friends and stayed friends for all those years, and how the romance between Marilla and John Blythe happened, and ultimately how it ended. And then we also get to see why Matthew didn't marry. And we also get to learn how Marilla came to be in the possession of the amethyst brooch. I mean, this book was so good. The romance between Marilla and John Blythe, it's steamy and it's hot. It is scandalous for the time. But it was so good. Typically, I do not like reading about romance, but the romance in this book was written so wonderfully and so beautifully, and oh, it was great to read about. We also have Marilla's Aunt Izzy, who is quite the character. Izzy has quite an impression on Marilla in her later life when she's a teenager, and she really inspires Marilla to try to be more independent and more like her Aunt Lizzie. So yeah, I liked her aunt a lot in this book. I wasn't expecting slavery to be such a large part of this book. For like the later half of this book, Marilla is involved in basically the Underground Railroad, where she's helping to hide slaves and basically give them. I wasn't expecting slavery to be part of this novel, and honestly, it feels a little bit out of place. I feel like if L.M. Montgomery were to write this book, it wouldn't have included that. Like, it feels like Marilla wouldn't be the one to be hiding away slaves in her house, you know? So it kind of didn't fit into the storyline all that much. But I mean, I'm glad that I read it. It was good, but just from looking at Marilla and what we know of her as a character, it just doesn't seem like she'd be hiding away slaves. But regardless of that, like that's my only critique of the book. I still liked the part, but I just think it wasn't realistic to Marilla's character. But overall, I love the book. Like, this is a book that I will definitely be rereading when I go to reread Anne of Green Gables. Like, this is a book that I will always reread. Ultimately, I ended up rating this a 4.5 stars on Goodreads. It's so good. It is so, so good. If you're wanting to read a good spin-off of Anne of Green Gables, this is the book to read. The next book we have is Anne of Green Gables, A New Beginning by Kevin Sullivan. The first thing that I will say about this book is that you cannot go into this book expecting it to be like the original Anne of Green Gables books. This book isn't a spin-off to the L.M. Montgomery book series, but it's more of a spin-off to the Kevin Sullivan Anne of Green Gables, you know, the 80s movies with Egan Follows and Jonathan Crombie. Like, this is the spin-off to this. If you go into this book thinking that it's just a spin-off to Anne of Green Gables, you're going to be very, very disappointed by this book. The sooner that you understand this about this book, the more likely you are to enjoy this book. This is very much an alternate storyline to Anne of Green Gables. If you've seen the 80s Kevin Sullivan movies, then you know that the movies are not true to the books. So basically in this book we followed a middle-aged Anne while the Second World War is raging. Her only adopted son Dominic has gone off to fight the war and he is presumed missing in action. And her husband Gilbert has already died due to the war, which was really sad to read about. In this book, Anne is a successful writer and she's now trying her hand at being a playwright. After spending a lot of time living in the States and Ontario, she moves back to PEI. Diana's family have lived in Green Gables for quite a while, but Diana and Fred are now in the Bermuda, so her children end up cleaning out Green Gables for Anne to live in. While Diana's children are cleaning out Green Gables, they discover a hidden compartment in the house with letters that were sent to Marilla Cuthbert from Anne's father, Walter Shirley, whom Anne always thought was dead. The novel then dives into flashbacks from Anne's early childhood, from when she was in different foster homes, basically being a child slave, and to when she was in the poorhouse. It also follows her when she is with her former foster family, who are basically on the run, or to her in-laws, who are pretty much rich. So Anne ends up living in this big extravagant house. She gets kicked out due to being accused of being a thief. She then later on gets let back in the house, but some conspiring goes on with the mill, in which she learns that her father is working at, and is then sent to an orphanage where she's adopted to Green Gables. So it's like the alternating storyline of the past and also the present. In present day, Anne ends up searching for her father, and then she learns that she actually has a half-brother that she didn't know about, because her father ended up marrying her former foster mother, and they had a child, but Anne never really knows why he doesn't reach out to her or ask her to live with him. So Anne's very confused by this. She then learns that her father has actually recently died, so she goes to where he lives and she oversees his funeral arrangements. And I guess her half-siblings don't want anything to do with Anne. They forbid Anne from having anything to do with his estate. They keep all of his money and his houses and whatnot. And they also deny the existence of their half-brother. Eventually though, Anne finds a way and she meets her half-brother. She also learns that her adopted son Dominic is a-okay. He's just staying longer in France because he's met a French woman and they are coming home to Green Gables to be married. Anne eventually bases her play off of her hardships as a child, and the play ends up becoming a huge hit for Anne. So I liked the alternative storyline in this. The only thing that I didn't like is that throughout the novel, Anne is kind of portrayed as being a liar. She says that when she first comes to Green Gables, she pretty much lied about her past to make herself look more favorable, or she used her wild imagination to make herself seem more interesting, which, to be honest, I really did not like Kevin Sullivan insinuating that Anne was a liar when she arrived at Green Gables. That was so frustrating, and I really did not like that about this book. But what I did enjoy is the alternating storyline and the history that we get into Anne's past. We learn that Anne's mother was presumably murdered by her father, and Anne's father is basically labeled as a murderer. She's an orphan when she's a baby. She's actually orphaned when she was like a child, like 8-ish. She thinks that her father is dead when she's young, and she ends up encountering him multiple times throughout the novel in her young life. But when she goes to live at Green Gables, she never knows what happened to him. I did like this better as a Before Green Gables. Like, this version of Before Green Gables was much better than Budge Wilson's. I liked this a lot more because the writing was much better and the storyline was also much better. I do have mixed feelings about it a little. I just wish they didn't call Anne a liar. It tore me up when Anne mentioned that her husband Gilbert has been dead for some years. Like, that pretty near killed me. While I did like this book as a backstory much better than Budge Wilson's, it was probably a 3 for me. I mean, there's things I didn't like about it and there's things that I liked about it, so it's a back and forth. And I think just because Kevin Sullivan strayed so much from the original Anne of Green Gables storyline, I think that if he stuck with the original books, his movies would be so much better. But it's great as an alternate storyline and an alternate beginning for Anne. So the last book we have is Maud by Melanie J. Fishbane. This is not a story of Anne of Green Gables. It is a story of our author, L.M. Montgomery, or Maud. So this is a well-researched but fictionalized account of Lucy Maud Montgomery's early life. This novel is actually quite well written and is very reminiscent of Maud's own writing style, so I really enjoyed this book. In this novel, we see Montgomery struggle with the loss of her mother from a young age and the absence of her father. She is orphaned by her mother, and her father abandons her, so she has to live with her grandparents and PEI. Grandparents are quite rigid. They have some very old-fashioned views about women and women's place in the world and their education. So Maud really clashes with her grandparents on education and going to school and reading and writing and all that type of stuff. At this point, Maud is actually an avid writer. She loves writing poetry and short stories. She has a few close friends, especially her friend Nate Lockhart. They are very close, but in the end they end up becoming lovers and they end up pretty much courting one another, which is very frowned upon because they follow different religions. So her grandparents actually read Maud's journal. They are very unimpressed by what she has to say about them in her journal, and then they find about the relationship she has with Nate, and then she is eventually shipped off to live with her father in Prince Albert, Saskatchewan. She leaves PEI on bad terms with her grandparents and also with Nate. Maud believes, though, that being with her father will help her to be closer to her mother. So Maud makes the journey out west to live with her father. She meets her father as well as her new stepmother, who is very rude towards Maud and really does not like her. It is obviously clear to Maud that her stepmother has quite a disdain towards her. Maud's stepmother really runs the household. She gets Maud's father to stop calling her Maudie, which he does very affectionately, so he stops calling her that, which Maud loves being called that by her father. While Maud is living with her father and her stepmother essentially gets her to be her slave. She does the cooking, the cleaning, and looking after her baby sister. Maud soon realizes that her stepmother sees her as nothing but a burden, and she basically has to earn her board even though that she's her father's daughter. Maud also has to do quite a bit of convincing in order to go to school. While she's at school, she does make some friends in the form of the Richard siblings, Laura and Will. Laura and Maud are really great friends, and Will and Maud end up becoming more than friends. But Maud's teacher, Mr. Mustard, is also quite interested in Maud, and Maud really does not appreciate his advances towards her. Mr. Mustard is a terrible teacher by all accounts. He really cannot get a good handle on the class. The class is very rowdy, and he comes to Maud's house because he and Maud's stepmother are friends, so he tries to court Maud very unsuccessfully and very pathetically. Maud is quite upset with this, as she is not interested in Mr. Mustard at all. Maud is also quite upset with her father when she realizes her father really doesn't stick up for her in the way that she kind of expects him to. She is not interested in Mr. Mustard at all. She doesn't appreciate his advances. She thinks that it's absolutely scandalous that her father and her stepmother leave her alone to entertain Mr. Mustard, which, if her grandmother knew, she said would cause quite the scandal. So Maud does everything in her power to make Mr. Mustard to dislike her. During this time, Maud submits some of her writing to the paper in PEI where it gets published. Her father and friends are delighted, but her stepmother absolutely hates it. Eventually, Maud cannot put up any longer living with her stepmother, nor the romantic aspirations of Mr. Mustard. She has just had enough. So sadly, Anne writes to her grandmother, who tells her that she can come home whenever she can get a ride home, pretty much, and Maud has to say goodbye to her friends Laura and Will, and Maud and Will by this point have become very, very close. They're essentially courting each other. Maud even contemplates staying in Prince Albert to marry Will. For Maud, her ambitions are much more, and she knows that she probably will never be happy being the wife of a farmer and having not been able to achieve her educational aspirations. She eventually returns home only to find that no one is there to pick her up, so she goes on over to her cousins who live relatively nearby. Once her grandmother finds out that Maud has spent much of her journey traveling alone, she's not impressed, as it was very scandalous at the time for women to travel alone unaccompanied by a male companion. Once she's home and settles in, her former teacher tries to get her to come back to school, but her grandfather will not allow Maud to go back to school. But eventually her teacher devises a plan where she is basically an assistant teacher, but she's actually just another student. So her grandfather agrees to this without knowing that Maud is being taught. So Maud goes to see Nate's mother, who's also the minister's wife and the organ teacher, and she suggests that Maud make a little extra money by becoming an organ instructor. So Maud pitches the idea to her grandparents. Her grandparents initially refuse, but her grandmother ends up convincing her husband, Maud's grandfather, to allow her to teach other children how to play the organ. So Maud goes to her cousins and she is given the money to basically teach him how to play the organ. Maud soon realizes that her grandmother has devised this plan that Maud can have the money to afford to go to college. Eventually, her grandfather comes around and sees that education isn't such a bad thing, and Maud eventually is allowed to go and get an education. Maud decides that she wants to either become a teacher and possibly a writer in the future. So this book has a very similar writing style to L.M. Montgomery's own writing. It's a great book. It's quite a hefty book. It's like 386 pages, so it's nearly 400 pages. It's quite fast paced too. Not a lot of it was slow. It moves quite quickly because it does span like over the span of 3 years or something. So yeah, the interesting thing that I have noticed while reading this book is that L.M. Montgomery models a lot of her characters, such as Anne and Gilbert and Diana and whatnot, either after herself or other people in her life. So Anne is very similar to Maud in many ways. They are similar in the sense that they both want to have an education. They're both orphans. They both like writing. They both love reading. And then there's many similarities between Nate and Will with Gilbert Blythe. So you can obviously see when reading this book how many parallels there are to Maud and the characters that she writes about, which I think is great, because if you do love Anne of Green Gables, then you're probably going to love this book because of the so many similarities that it has with Anne of Green Gables. So I really enjoyed reading this book. Again, this isn't quite a spin-off to the Anne of Green Gables series, but it's in the Anne of Green Gables world because the novel was inspired by our author. So yeah, I think that if you're a die-hard Anne of Green Gables fan, you are going to love reading this book because of the striking similarities between Anne and Montgomery herself. I ended up rating this book a 4 stars on Goodreads. And that concludes my Anne of Green Gables spin-off books. I hope you all enjoyed the reviews. If you liked this video, please be sure to give it a thumbs up. Subscribe if you're new. Please be sure to check me out on Instagram, Goodreads, and Twitter. My links will be in the description below. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you guys next time. Bye!